What if Tim Burton directed The Black Cauldron? Well, he almost did. And Don Bluth? Maybe he wasn't the wide-eyed neighborly animator from Utah, but rather he was playing a ruthless game of strategy inside Disney's Magic Kingdom. Here are 10 wild Disney facts that most fans have never heard. So as most of you know, I'm an amateur Disney historian, having written and produced a play about the life of Roy O. Disney. And I recently got to sit down with Steve Anderson, the animator who directed both Meet the Robinsons and the 2011 Winnie the Pooh movie. And he gave me a copy of his new book called Disney in Between, which chronicles the years between Walt's passing in 1966 through to the beginning of the Disney Renaissance in the late 1980s. The era is sometimes referred to as the Bronze Age of animation, or the Lost Years, because the company struggled without Walt at the helm. But this was the era of Anderson's childhood, and he put more than a decade of research into piecing this all together. So if you're a hardcore Disney fan like me, who thinks they already know everything about Disney history, sit back and prepare to be edified. Just a quick note, this list isn't ranked by importance, I'm mainly going in chronological order. So, without further ado, number 10, Card Walker admits that Disney was boring. It's no secret that in the years after Walt's passing, Disney's creativity was in a bit of a rut. But what I was shocked to read was that Disney executives weren't ashamed of that fact. Rather, they bragged about it. Esmond Carden Walker, known affectionately as Card, began his career at Disney in the traffic division, but he quickly rose up the ranks. While Walt was alive, he became the vice president of sales and advertising, and he served on the Disney board of directors. In 1971, he became the company president, and in 1976, he became the CEO. He's best known for building the Epcot theme park in Florida. But what you might not know is a common phrase he'd utter to shareholders and investors. We may bore you, but we'll never shock you. You heard that right. He embraced the boring. That's a mind-boggling statement to make publicly. But Card Walker saw himself as the guardian of Walt's reputation. Now say what you want about Walt Disney, but I don't think anyone would say that Walt's greatest achievements were boring. According to Anderson, Card Walker was a harsh man who fiercely guarded what the Disney brand should be. Anything too experimental or too unlike the family-friendly image people had come to expect might damage the brand, and so it was for the most part forbidden. So if Disney's content from the 1970s seemed a little bland or mundane, you can look back to Card Walker's infamous phrase, "He didn't want to rock the boat," which leads to my next point. Number 9. Ward Kimball left Disney due to boredom. Ward Kimball was one of Walt's 9 old men, the legendary animators who helped shape Disney's golden and silver ages. Ward was known for being irreverent, funny, and irrepressible. He's also the one who got Walt Disney interested in trains, which helped inspire Walt to build a theme park. And he's my personal favorite of the 9 old men, not only because of his zany personality, but also because he protected trailblazing black animator Floyd Norman when Norman was being racially bullied at the studio. You'd think that after Walt's death, Disney executives would rely even more heavily on someone like Kimball to help push animation forward, but instead, the opposite happened. Kimball's work was increasingly seen by the top brass as un-Disney, despite all of his work on Snow White and Pinocchio and many other films, not to mention his bagging an Oscar for the 1970 short film It's Tough to Be a Bird, one of Disney's few Academy Awards through the 1970s. Executives began telling him that his work didn't really fit with what Disney animation was, quote, supposed to be. But whereas Walt had occasionally allowed Ward to be bold and experimental, the new leadership increasingly narrowed his creative range, and eventually the frustration pushed him out. Kimball would still return to mentor young animators, but when they asked him why he had retired, his answer was just one word: boredom. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter, he was just bored. Number 8. Winnie the Pooh meets the Exorcist in the Gross Gallery. When future Aladdin director Ron Clements joined Disney in 1974, he got a very unusual welcome. Disney animators had something called the Gross Gallery, where they depict Disney characters in grotesque ways. The Exorcist had just come out and it had rocked the landscape of pop culture. And Clements arrived to find his desk decorated with a veritable gallery with drawings of Winnie the Pooh characters reenacting the scenes from The Exorcist. From head spinning to projectile vomiting, the whole thing. And this was decades before the cheap slasher series Blood and Honey. It's a reminder that Disney animators have always had a dark, irreverent sense of humor behind the scenes. These are artists who occasionally need to blow off steam, and they're never afraid to push the boundaries or poke fun at beloved characters. But honestly, this makes me wonder, if this made it into the gross gallery, what other creepy, messed up drawings did they create? Number 7. Charo dancing in The Fox and the Hound. During the Disney in-between years, animators loved using Phil Harris. He popped up again and again and again. So during the troubled production of The Fox and the Hound, director Willie Reitherman, another one of Walt's 9 Old Men, tried to solve what he felt was a pacing issue by adding a late musical number towards the end of the film. 2 crane birds would dance around for the titular characters, adding some fun and spice. But Willie Reitherman didn't stop with Phil Harris. He brought in the famously flamboyant Charo. Yes, that Charo. She and Phil recorded a brand new song together, and Reitherman even invited her into the studio so she could dance for the animators, giving them direct inspiration from her sultry kinetic moves. They sequenced the storyboard, and, well, everybody hated it. Some people felt that Charo made the movie a little too burlesque, and it certainly didn't fit in with the tone of the film. And in this case, I think caution was probably the right call, but the fact is, deep inside the Disney vault, there's a Charo Phil Harris song just dying to break out. It's been over 40 years. Come on, Disney, let's free Charo.
Move it in like this, a little bit closer.
Number 6. Don Bluth shot Santa Claus. Allegedly. When you think of Don Bluth, you probably see the folksy guy from Utah who forged a new path in animation. He worked at Disney for a while before starting his own company, but that's only half the story. There's really no other way of putting it. Don Bluth brought a lot of drama. Far from his neighborly demeanor, he could be egotistical, ruthless, and mean. His behavior reminded me more of a character from Game of Thrones than someone who was just trying to take animation to the next level. Of course, that meant the chapters revolving around him were complete page-turners. And frankly, he could have had 4 spots on this list, but I narrowed it down to the 2 things I found most shocking. One of the most emotionally charged stories in Disney In-Between revolves around a short film called The Small One, and how it was taken away from legendary animator Erik Larson, another one of Walt's 9 Old Men. The Small One was a quiet, tender story about a poor boy in biblical times, forced to sell his beloved donkey who could no longer work on the family farm. And after a few mishaps, the donkey was then sold to Joseph and Mary on their way to Bethlehem. It's a parable about loss, compassion, and letting go. In 1977, Erik Larson was asked to direct the short film, and this time he'd get to mentor many of Disney's new trainees fresh out of college. So imagine just graduating, and your first job is to work on an actual Disney film under the guidance of one of Walt's 9 Old Men. For many of them, this was the closest they would ever come to working directly with Walt Disney, and it was a dream come true. That is, until Bluth came along. Don Bluth had long argued that Larson's program for training new animators was stale, that it relied too heavily on repetition, tradition, and old methods that no longer prepared animators for the future. Then something happened that none of the young animators were prepared for. One Monday morning, the team arrived at work to find everything was gone. Every drawing, every storyboard, every scene had mysteriously been removed over the weekend. Erik Larson was informed that the top brass had decided to give the movie to Don Bluth, naming him as the new director. How this decision was made was never officially confirmed. Some say Disney's son-in-law Ron Miller made the decision all on his own. Others suggest that Bluth's allies lobbied Miller, so then Bluth would give his acolytes the best assignments. But many suspected that Bluth himself went directly to Ron Miller and demanded that he be given the project. Don Bluth saw himself as the future of Disney animation, and he wanted to make that clear to the entire company. Erik Larson, in his view, was simply too old and no longer fit to lead such an important project. Ron Miller was known for his laid-back management style. He wasn't someone who upended projects lightly or went looking to upset the apple cart unless it was absolutely necessary. And a decision this abrupt, stripping one of the legendary 9 Old Men of a film mid-production, doesn't feel like something Miller would have initiated on his own. And there's one other reason in the book that leads me to conclude that Bluth was making a Game of Thrones type of move. Bluth publicly apologized in 2019. In a social media post, he acknowledged that the small one should have remained with Erik Larsen and the trainees. That apology, decades later, strongly suggests he knew he had crossed a line, and he understood his role in how the decision was made. The emotional fallout of Larsen's removal was immediate. The genial Erik Larsen was himself devastated. One animator later said that watching Larsen be removed felt like someone had, quote, shot Santa Claus dead in front of our eyes. For the young artists, it wasn't just about losing a project. It was about losing a mentor, a protector, and a direct connection to Disney's golden era. And Larsen would never direct any other Disney film or short ever again. That decision fractured relationships, poisoned trust, and permanently damaged Bluth's standing with many in the company. And in a studio already struggling with identity and inertia, it marked a turning point. So did Don Bluth shoot Santa Claus? That might be up for debate, but for a Christmas movie, he certainly seemed to be acting like the Grinch. Number 5. Don Bluth's resignation was public and nasty. As I mentioned earlier, you may have seen this photo of Don Bluth in a truck with his friends. It seems harmless, just him and a few colleagues boldly going off to start their own company, one that could be edgy, a bit scary, and try to create new styles of animation. But nope, the reality was far more complicated and far messier. By the late 1970s, Bluth had become a powerful figure inside Disney animation, especially among younger artists. Some animators said he had his own little cult of followers, and they'd work in his garage on weekends, creating non-Disney cartoons. This was despite Ron Miller positioning Bluth as the future head of Disney animation. Miller made clear on numerous occasions that Bluth would be the creative centerpiece for a new generation. Then, very suddenly, with no warning, Bluth pulled the trigger. On September 13, 1979, Bluth and 16 other artists marched into Disney HR and resigned, one by one. Each person explained their grievances and resigned on the spot, with no notice. The timing alone made the departure explosive. Animation crews were much smaller back then, and losing so many key artists at once severely damaged The Fox and the Hound. Bluth took around a third of the team, and the film's release had to be pushed back an entire year. Inside the studio, many felt the exit had been deliberately timed to do maximum harm. What made it worse was that the departure wasn't quiet. Bluth was happy to hype up the mass resignation to the media, creating a public spectacle and a huge embarrassment for the Disney company. Bluth was noisy, highly visible, and impossible to contain. Disney was a large, symbolic target, and the way Bluth departed guaranteed attention. All eyes would be on him and his new studio. Ron Miller tried to put on a brave face, but privately he felt shaken and betrayed. He had invested in Bluth, trusted him, and believed he was grooming him for leadership. The sudden loss and the way it unfolded left deep scars in the animation community. Ron Miller told the remaining Disney employees, "Well, the cancer has been removed." Yikes, to be described as a cancer by Walt Disney's son-in-law, that kind of speaks for itself. That's not to take away from Bluth's accomplishments. He did go on to make some great movies like The Land Before Time and American Tail, but ultimately his own studio went bankrupt. Like Cersei Lannister, he could play the Game of Thrones, but when he got to the top, his results were mixed, to say the least. Number 4. Tim Burton's version of the Black Cauldron. Many people know that Tim Burton began his career as a Disney animator, and that he never actually quite fit in. But what's not known is that for a brief moment around 1980, Disney actually seemed open to new ideas. Because of the success of Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, some thought that the Black Cauldron could be used to try something more adventurous, catering to a slightly older demographic. Burton's ideas for the films were unlike anything Disney had ever attempted. For the Horned King, rather than having a basic sidekick, Burton imagined a villain who consulted a set of creepy puppets, little manifestations of his own fears and doubts, before making any big decisions. Burton also proposed that the villainous king's horns would grow larger and more twisted as his anxiety increased, turning the villain's inner fear into a physical manifestation. For the dragon-like creatures, Burton proposed giant gnarly hands with wings that would fly around the kingdom in search of the magic pig. He envisioned the fair folk as partially vegetable-like organic beings that grew out of the earth. Among some artists, there was excitement. Maybe Disney might be willing to move beyond its familiar style and embrace something bolder and darker. But as Burton's ideas filtered up, the reaction from leadership was swift and uneasy. Burton's ideas were too strange, too abstract, too far from what a Disney film was supposed to be. One by one, his concepts were rejected. Ron Miller ultimately decided that The Black Cauldron needed to be a, quote, classic Disney movie, and that translated to keep it safe. Burton was allowed to make a few short projects afterwards, but The Black Cauldron revealed the limits of Disney's openness. The studio briefly invited experimentation, then pulled back. Burton would soon move on, carrying these same dark motifs with him, which made him a huge success, both with Batman and then later again with Disney. But what about now? With Disney's penchant for making live-action remakes, maybe Disney needs to invite Tim Burton to remake this cult classic in a dark and edgy manner. What do you guys think? Would you want to see Tim Burton direct a live-action adaptation of The Black Cauldron? Let me know in the comments how you think it would turn out. Number 3. How The Black Cauldron gave birth to Mickey's Christmas Carol. Given how protective Disney is over their intellectual property, you look at the warm, nostalgic Mickey's Christmas Carol and assume it came from years of careful internal debate, a project slowly vetted, refined, and approved over decades. Something safe, something obvious, something inevitable. In reality, it came out of conflict. During the tumultuous production of The Black Cauldron, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Creative disagreements had hardened into open friction, and longtime story artist Burny Mattinson, who had been with the company since the 1950s, found himself repeatedly second-guessed by the directors, who questioned his instincts and openly criticized his excellent work. Mattinson was always known for being upbeat, generous, and unfailingly good-natured, but eventually, the criticism made him furious. Mattinson freely admitted that he blew his cork. In a meeting meant to review his storyboard sequence, he pushed back hard. He raised his voice, he told the directors they were wrong, he said he'd been around long enough to know when something worked, and that he was tired of the constant nitpicking and second-guessing. It was loud, it was forceful, and by his own description, it was very un-Burny. Walking home that night, Mattinson was convinced he had crossed a line. He knew he was facing the axe. Later that night, he was discussing the drama with his wife, Sylvia, herself an artist. She reminded him of an idea he had quietly carried around for years. A simple, heartfelt adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, using Disney characters to bring the story to life. It would be timeless, nostalgic, and yet sincere. So with nothing left to lose, Mattinson decided to act. He wrote a short 2-paragraph memo to Ron Miller outlining the idea. And the next day, Miller summoned him into his office. Mattinson entered, expecting to be fired. Miller sat back at his desk, head down, reading the note in silence. The awkward pause stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Miller looked up, scowling. "What the hell are you sending me this for?" Miller snapped, tossing the memo back across the desk. Mattinson, certain that this was it, didn't retreat. He defended the idea outright. He said he thought it was a damn good treatment. He spoke plainly, honestly, the way someone does when they have nothing left to lose. Then something unexpected happened. Miller broke into laughter. "I think it's a great idea," he said. The tension evaporated. The grilling was over. Mattinson wasn't being reprimanded, he was being greenlit. Miller told him to start storyboarding immediately. In a quiet, almost poetic twist, one of Disney's most beloved Christmas films was born not from caution, but from frustration. Mickey's Christmas Carol didn't emerge despite the chaos of The Black Cauldron. It emerged because of it. And we're all better for it. Number 2. The Brave Little Toaster was almost the world's first computer-generated movie. Most people remember The Brave Little Toaster as a heartwarming animated movie made for the Disney Channel, but it almost became one of the most historical movies of all time. Coming off the cutting new effects from Tron, a small group inside Disney began to wonder whether computer animation could be used not just for special effects or backgrounds, but for an entire full-length feature. Future Pixar founder John Lasseter, who was a junior animator at the time, became obsessed with this idea. He believed the toaster and the other mechanical characters were ideal candidates for early CGI animation. Their hard edges, hinges, and manufactured movements perfectly matched what the new technology could do in the 80s. Crucially, Lasseter found an unlikely champion in a live-action Disney executive who saw Tron as a glimpse of a new possible future in special effects. That support, however, ignited a territorial war. Animation executives viewed the project as an invasion of their territory, and using CGI in such a way was an anathema to their traditional techniques, so the two sides argued. When the dispute reached the top, Ron Miller ultimately sided with the animation executives, effectively killing the film in its CGI incarnation. Lasseter was fired shortly thereafter. Looking back, author Steve Anderson said, "It's mind-boggling to think of how different the future of Disney animation would have been had Miller chosen differently. Disney would have made the first computer-animated feature film and would have made it a good 10 years before Lasseter eventually did at Pixar. Disney would have been leading rather than following." Number 1. The unsung hero, Burny Mattinson. Before reading this book, I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that I had never heard of Burny Mattinson. He wasn't a household name, he wasn't one of the 9 old men, and he never chased the spotlight. But if you worked in Disney animation at any point over the past 70 years, you almost certainly encountered him. He began his career at Disney in 1953, starting in the mailroom, literally handing Walt Disney his weekly paycheck. But he eventually got into animation, working as an in-betweener on Lady and the Tramp. As you saw, he directed Mickey's Christmas Carol and went on to direct The Great Mouse Detective. And he also played a role in all the great movies from Jungle Book to Lion King to Big Hero 6. Mattinson holds the record for Disney's longest ever employee. He worked at the Disney studio for 70 years, longer than Walt's entire lifetime. But Burny's real contribution wasn't just in animation and story, it was continuity. For artists like Steve Anderson, Burny became the living bridge between generations, the keeper of institutional memory when others moved on. Anderson dedicated the book to Burny, who passed away in 2023, and it's clear that Burny's career was the backbone of the book. What's evident is that Steve genuinely loved and admired Burny as a mentor. Steve grew up during the Disney in-between years, admiring much of Mattinson's work. And when the two got to work together on the 2011 version of Winnie the Pooh, you can tell it was a dream come true. Burny shared his memories freely, offered insights, and never guarded credit. He believed that stories were meant to be passed on. And it seems also that Steve Anderson helped quietly broker something even more meaningful, a healing. Decades after Don Bluth left Disney in one of animation's most painful ruptures, Burny welcomed Bluth back. Not with bitterness, not with scorekeeping, but with lunch, conversation, and shared memories. Old wounds were acknowledged, then allowed to rest. Burny Mattinson wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He wasn't the most famous, but he's probably the most important animator you didn't know. There's a reason Disney featured Burny in their 100th anniversary film, Once Upon a Studio. Because when Disney needed animators to stay the course, Burny was steady. Burny never forgot where Disney came from, even as he embraced where it was going. And when old wounds needed healing, Burny chose grace. So if you, like me, love any Disney film from Lady and the Tramp to Big Hero 6, you owe Burny Mattinson a real debt of gratitude. And my thanks to Steve Anderson for introducing me to this unsung hero. So if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for letting me share a little bit of Disney history with you. As always, if you enjoyed it, please give it a like, and let me know in the comments how many of these top 10 facts you already knew, or which one surprised you the most. And regardless, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Disney in Between. Like the animation process it's named after, this book lives in the space between the big names, from Walt Disney to Michael Eisner, and it shows how the unglamorous, sometimes rough work in the middle is what actually holds everything together. And without it, renewal might never be possible.